Hello and welcome. I'm Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and various of my colleagues are here as well who will introduce themselves in a sec. This is the third of our place-based events looking at audiences in Hampshire. Hopefully that's no great surprise. You're Hampshire organisations, so presumably it's not. So we'll be talking about a whole range of different things this morning, looking at the local population, looking at people who are engaging and booking, looking at some findings from the Cultural Participation Monitor in terms of overall public attitudes, including specific to the Southeast. So lots to get through, lots to talk about. We are a relatively select group, which does allow us to be a little bit more kind of conversational and chatty. So I thought it might be quite nice if we started off by just doing a quick round the room of intros, just so we know who's here and where they're from. And then on the way through, please feel free to kind of interject, ask questions, whether in the chat or indeed just speak up. And we'll try and sort of make it very much more of a discussion and really talking about what you want to know and drawing on your knowledge as well as what we've got to share. So just before we do intros, a couple of really practical things. We're recording the session. We won't record the chat, sort of the discussion bit at the end. There's transcription if you want it, if you just click on the button that's at the bottom. If you need any help with anything, just put a question in the chat or shout. And we will have a bit of a break partway through just to give people a chance to rest, so we're not having 2 straight hours of solid data without any kind of respite. Introduce myself. Megan, do you maybe want to introduce yourself and then pass on to someone else? We'll go around that way.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan. I'm in the Audience Finder team at the Audience Agency, so I'm sure I've spoken to a few of you in the past about surveys or ticketing setups and one-to-one sessions and all the rest of it. Just to say, a couple of areas that I look after that might be of interest to you guys. I look after the Audience Agency's online community, which is somewhere where if you want to have a bit of a chat afterwards, there's a place there for that to happen, and we'd love to see you over there. And also we have just started running we call them Know Your Community surgery events, which are kind of one-to-one discussion-based sessions with us, looking at your local audiences and local data. So if this session kind of sparks something off for you and you want to have a bit of a chat to us on a more one-to-one level, then please do get in touch. We'll post the links after the session or in the chat or in whatever way we do. Cool, so that's me. I hope you enjoy, and I'm going to pass on to Elise, if that's okay.
Thanks, Megan. My name is Elise, and I am the researcher in the evidence team at the Audience Agency. So a lot of the data that we're going to look at today, I will have pulled out for you. So I hope, but with Oliver, of course. So I hope that, yeah, I can help you out if you have any questions on the data or in the discussion. And I'm going to pass on to Amelia, who's next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I look after all the PR and marketing for Jane Austen's house.
Nice.
I don't know who I'm passing on to.
Can you see anyone else on the list?
Hang on. Wait, I can see. Why don't I pass on to my colleague Lizzie?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm the director of Jane Austen's house, and I will pass on to, hang on, let me look at participant list, Rosie. This is a name I've picked out.
Do we have a Rosie?
We do it on mute.
Oh, no.
Pick someone else, on to Joe.
Morning, everyone. As you can probably see, I'm Joe. I'm from Turner Sims, Southampton, which is a 400-seater concert hall on the grounds of Highfield campus at University of Southampton. I'm going to pass on to Victoria.
I work as campaign manager at Mayfair Theatre in Southampton. Oh, sorry, can you hear me? Oh no, I've got new headsets, so this is obviously 2022 syndrome catching up from 2021. Yeah, I work as campaign manager at Mayfair Theatre in Southampton.
And maybe Michelle?
Hi there, I'm Michelle Cohen and I'm the Fundraising Development Manager at St Barb Museum and Art Gallery in Lymington.
Fab. And maybe Marcus?
Can't hear you.
Oh, no.
No.
Totally no audio. Sorry about that. Oh, that looks like he's going to pop something in the chat. And we've got Rosie and Bill Basingstoke. And is there anyone else we haven't heard from yet? To speak up or put your hand up. The other thing maybe just to check is because obviously this is Hampshire is not an area where I typically work. So do you all know each other really well already? Is this like me crashing a party that everyone else knows each other? Fine, okay. It's just good to know. Anyway, maybe today's a good chance for you to have a bit of a chat and discuss shared questions and issues anyway. And so without more ado, I will carry on. And let's see what we can. Brilliant. Marcus from Hampshire Cultural Trust. So very new in post. Excellent. And I did a very quick look up of Hampshire Cultural Trust, and goodness me, that's an awful lot of venues you've got to look after. Fantastic. So I'm in the unusual position of doing this type of event, of actually talking about an area that I have at least briefly lived in, because many years ago I lived in the Meon Valley for a couple of years, but it's been a while and things have changed. So this is me talking from our data really more than anything else. So do bring your local insights to bear. Anyway, enough of the preamble. So what we are going to be chatting about is looking at some things around the local area, local population, what types of people are in the area, and partly using audience spectrum. I don't know whether people are familiar with audience spectrum. Some are, some may be less familiar. I'll do a bit of a talk through about audience spectrum to explain what that is, but essentially it's our profiling tool. Talk a bit about the local audiences, so who can we see from the audience finder aggregated data is engaging, looking at that in terms of some analysis of some sales data, but also looking at some mapping, including a particularly jazzy map which Elise has been working on, and then we'll have a bit of a chance for discussion about what you've made of what we've said and what we think it all might mean or imply, and then do a bit of a sort of a wrap up and what that might mean. So that is the plan for the session, if that sounds good to everyone. A couple of other little bits of preamble in terms of what we're looking at and how. So this little thing on the right is one of my side interests. I'm a big fan of the writer James Joyce, and if you've read his portrait of the artist, there's a bit at the beginning where the young Stephen Dedalus does the thing that I'm sure all of us have done at some point. In fact, my son, my 8-year-old, did it just a couple of days ago. He came to me and said, "It's amazing, you can actually work out your address and you can just keep going upwards forever, and it's really cool." So Stephen Dedalus sits there in class and works out, I'm in this class, this school, this county, this country, this continent, the world, the universe, all these different layers of thinking about your place. And then he sort of goes back down the list and goes, "Oh," and it all comes back down to me. That's essentially what we're doing with the data sets. So we've got national level data for some bits, other stuff that's regional, stuff at the county level, bits split within the county, and then finally the basic level we've chosen to use for this is ward level, just because it's a nice kind of size of granularity. And different data sets kind of plug into that scale at different points. So some data sets, things like audience finder ticketing data, you can use pretty much any scale because it just aggregates at whatever level. For other data sets, we can really talk to a certain level, but then below that it gets a bit tricky. So things like the cultural participation monitor, it's a nationally representative survey. The last wave had 6,000 sample, which is really quite chunky. which works quite well until you get down to about a regional level, because then you start getting down to a few hundred people. And if you break it down much further than that, you just don't have a big enough sample to talk confidently about what it's saying. So for some things, they'll work at that level, other things will work at a more granular level. What else to say? So this is the area we're looking at. We've pulled out 4 of the towns stroke cities that we're saying little particular bits more about as well. Of course, they're not the only major settlements, but yeah, we had to focus on a few. So this is the ones we picked. So again, it's that range of data applied to each of them. Then audience spectrum. I will be talking about this quite a bit, so it's probably worth us just being clear about what it is and what it says. So forgive me if you do know it really well, but if you don't, this might be kind of like a quite useful starting point. Essentially what we did, and this is a few years ago now, is we took national survey data about who engages with what arts and culture, and some really detailed responses about which particular art forms, or galleries, museums, their donation habits, their other interests, communication preferences, all sorts of stuff, from the Taking Part survey, which is the DCMS run national engagement survey, which is currently in the process of being replaced. So watch that space. But so we took that big data set, we split it into 10 groups based on essentially how much people engage with arts and culture and the types of arts and culture they engage with. So broadly speaking, it splits into 3 groups: higher engaged, middle engaged, lower engaged. And then within those, there are kind of clusters that have particular characteristics and types. But we also mixed in some other stuff in there, like proximity to cultural infrastructure and stuff. But essentially, it's about what people do. So it's a culturally based segmentation model. It's also linked to geography. So we know which of these segments each household is most likely to be in. And we can then aggregate that up to say, well, what proportion of people are likely to be in each ward or in each area or in each county or whatever. So we have high engaged segments, which are metroculturals, so super high engaged, heavily concentrated in London, sort of affluent professionals, high educational attainment and so forth as well. Experience seekers, who tend to be younger, on the edge of towns and cities, a preponderance in the south, so 59% in the south as opposed to elsewhere, and again tend to be high educational attainment but relatively younger, and so you'll often find them around university cities, and indeed we will today, and hinterland culture buffs, who are super core audience for lots and arts and cultural venues, particularly once you get further away from London. Relatively affluent professionals, with a tendency to engage a lot in a variety of different things, but with a slight skew towards sort of, if you like, this sort of classic arts, but not super traditional. They also do other stuff. But those, if you like, those 3 between them are our kind of really high engaged groups. Then we have 3 groups, all of which are quite interesting in this area, where we've got, roughly speaking, dormitory dependables, a kind of dormitory town, middle-aged but slightly older, may or may not have families, but they're kind of quite middle Brittany, if you like. Trips and treats are younger families, again in sort of suburban towns, and then home and heritage are a little bit on the older side with a bit of a more traditional taste. We often characterize them as kind of classic National Trust members, by which we don't mean the National Trust members who take their kids all the time, we mean the other National Trust members. So that's roughly speaking the middle engaged groups. And then finally, there are the 4 lower engaged groups, of which there are varying concentrations in different places. Actually, there's not huge proportions of most of these in Hampshire, interestingly, which I guess tells you something as well, as a starting point about Hampshire's audiences. But you've got Up our street, who tend to be on the older side, tend to be very settled communities, particularly lots of northern terraces around where I live. Will have loads of up our streets in them. Then you'll have kaleidoscope creativity, which is often younger, often a bit more diverse, not always. A tendency to kind of be, people living in flats and sort of starting out. You've got Facebook families who tend to be highly digitally engaged, hence the name, but sort of younger, often low-income families. And we do have pockets of those in this area. And then finally, heydays, who tend to be much more sort of an older group, often in sheltered accommodation or supported housing, with some a few other types mixed in there, but essentially they're kind of very much more lower engaged, particularly often because of age and ill health. And breathe. So that was like a quick romp through all 10. We will be referencing different ones of these on the way through, but it is worth noting that there's loads more information about each of these segments on our website. So if you are looking at what we're saying today and go, oh, actually, there's a whole load of stuff relating to this group that seems to be quite relevant to me, or there's a pocket of them right next to where we're based, you can look up loads more information, the kinds of things they're interested in, whether they donate, how far they travel, their kind of demographics, family composition, all that kind of thing. So there's hopefully lots of extra stuff there. Everyone's still with me? Fab. Okay. So this is the bunch of stuff that went into making it. Each one has those extra profiles, as I mentioned. If you look on the bottom right, there's interests, location, preferences, how to engage, and more attached to each of them. So there's quite a lot of information. We've also written summaries of how we think that they're impacted by COVID, which again might be quite helpful to think about, and we'll talk about that a bit on the way through today. So we are all of that by way of introduction. Now we get to the local population. And of course, you will have first-hand experience of this in a way that I often don't. But what we're going to be looking at is who people are demographically, looking overall and at those 4 particular places, looking at audience spectrum, who they are, where they are, which ones are key in particular areas, but also looking at the 3 largest groups, which account for almost 2/3 the whole population of the county, and where they are. And then finally looking into this big national survey, the Population Monitor, at what that tells us about people around here. So, first up, looking at the overall population. So this is just looking at these 4 town/cities. We can see that, broadly speaking, the age profile is skewing somewhat younger in most cases, as you would expect, with a few interesting outliers. And obviously some of these will affect each of you differently based on where you are. Basingstoke has substantially fewer people in the 16 to 24 age group. It also has, if we look bottom right, substantially fewer students, and these things are obviously not unconnected. So there's that distinction to note. There's also when we, Basingstoke has more people in the middle age categories and therefore are more likely to have families with children, and sure enough, they show up in the under 15 or the under 16 category. Winchester is of course delightful and a little bit unusual. So very much an older population, high proportions of people who are students. We'll see when we get to the mapping, they're also very atypical in some other ways as well. Broadly speaking, it's, and I was having a bit of a chat to Elise about this morning, because there are a lot of people in Southampton and Portsmouth, but compared to the size of the whole region, it's not as heavily concentrated in the urban centres as is the case in maybe some other regions. So we're talking about 500,000 people across the 2 cities, out of 1.8 million. So there's a lot of population spread out right across the area, despite obviously neighbouring national parks. The actual Hampshire itself has quite a lot. across wide areas, but it's a very largely white population. Worth noting that the ethnicity stats here are from the 2011 census, and so they may have moved a bit. But broadly speaking, the larger the centre, the higher the population who aren't white. So, what else to note? The other thing maybe to flag is that Basingstoke, very high employed population rather than other categories. So, and indeed, when you get to the northeast corner of Hampshire, you start getting, probably because you've got places like Farnborough and Aldershot, you're getting into sort of high concentrations of younger technical occupations, etc., linked to the kind of the military activity in those corners. So this then is the overall audience spectrum profile. There is another slide which we'll share when we circulate them that shows all the percentages for these, but where we've got slides with loads and loads of bars, we've decided to dial down the numbers a little bit and just actually look at the overall picture. So here we can see that in terms of the overall population, there are a lot in the southeast, which is the speckled bars, but also Hampshire, of community land culturalists and poultry dependables, and also in Hampshire, lots of trips and treats. So those three, as I said, account for 2/3 of the population within these particular groups. So that's kind of, I think, quite a striking concentration, and we'll come back to that as we go through. There are lower concentrations if you look at the blue bars, the kind of lower engaged groups. There are lower concentrations of some of these lower engaged groups, particularly compared to England as a whole, and pretty much in line with the southeast as a group. Some more Facebook families than elsewhere in the southeast, but not hugely. And if we then look at some of the other ones, so metroculturals and experience seekers, two of our really highly engaged groups. Metroculturals, there are very few in Hampshire. Again, they're concentrated in London and other major cities, so that would be why. But we'll come back to them because they show up in an interesting place later on. Little teaser. And we've also got quite a lot of experience seekers in line with the southeast, above the national average. We know they skew towards the south, so that's not maybe a surprise. But they are quite concentrated in where they're located, which we'll come back to. So where you do have them, you have absolutely loads of them. And then I think the only group I've not referenced in any way yet is home and heritage. So that was that older middle engaged group. Potentially, I would have thought in the market for things like Jane Austen's house, but they're a little bit overrepresented in this area, but not loads. However, they tend not to be in the cities, so they will be more out of the rural areas, which might mean you have slightly higher concentrations nearer Alton than in other parts. So that's the overall picture. Let's zoom in a bit more detail to look at these individual towns and cities. And this is where we get our little shot in the arm of metroculturals out on a limb in Winchester. So it's not a huge number of people, but very clearly more concentrated in Winchester than elsewhere. I guess this may not come as a massive surprise to those of you that know Winchester, but it does have this really strong sort of umbilical link to London and people commuting because it's just such a nice place. Then they choose to live further out to live there, etc. But really high for that group. But Winchester also, if you look across the next two highly engaged categories, is really high for those as well. So essentially, Winchester is a very, very happy hunting ground for arts audiences, which is great for those of you who are based, I guess, not where any of you are, because none of you are Winchester, but it's within striking range of everyone. So, there's opportunities there. And we'll come back to Winchester as the kind of interesting central point that's sort of straddling between the city catchment areas as well, as we come later on. Just by the way, Elise, can you keep an eye on the chat? Because we have Marcus, you do have sites in Winchester. There we are. And then you're laughing. Fantastic. So in terms of other areas, we've got really big concentrations of experience seekers in Southampton, being on for a third of the population, which is huge. Obviously lots of university graduates, which would fit with the universities, and lots of people in potentially kind of maybe more concentrations of people starting out in some of these kind of graduate careers in the city. And we've got lots of trips and treats, but particularly Portsmouth and Basingstoke. And when we come to the mapping, we'll see there's really big concentrations in certain areas of Portsmouth, which is, I think, quite key for how Portsmouth plays out in terms of audiences. And Basingstoke, again, is the one that has the biggest concentration of this low-income family group, Facebook families. So maybe the other thing just to note, I talked about our street as being lots in these kind of quite settled communities in bigger cities, and there they are, not huge numbers, but in the biggest cities. So if that's giving us a bit of a flavour of the different areas, let's ask if it will let me click on, start looking sort of visually the overall picture. Now, don't worry, we do have zooms, so you don't need to squint too hard at this. But just to start with, really key, obvious point to make is, so this is showing for each ward which segment there are more of than any other. Okay, and clearly the map is almost entirely red. So for most of Hampshire, rather fittingly given the county's badge, it's all this lovely red colour. So loads of community land culture buffs, right through basically through all the rural areas. They're the dominant group. Now, you might think that's just what rural audiences do, so seeing it here, but it isn't necessarily. Where we've looked at rural areas elsewhere in the country, you might see more of the dormitory dependables, which are speckled through here and there, but sometimes they can be more dominant, or indeed home and heritage can often be quite dominant in other parts. So worth noting here, large concentrations of these very core audience, quite affluent, broad range of cultural tastes, generally quite culturally engaged. So that's, broadly speaking, pretty good news. When we start zooming in on particular areas, the more built up areas tend to have obviously greater concentrations of different groups. Winchester, although it had more metroculturals than anyone else did, they're not the majority for any particular ward, but they do have a little concentration of experience seekers there. And again, they're seen in good numbers in the west side of Southampton. Not knowing Southampton as well as other bits, I did a bit of a cheat on Google Maps, where I basically Googled the location of supermarkets by brand, and could see quite clearly that the west side of Southampton is the site that has Waitrose. So there we are. That's a little bit of what's going on there. When you start looking to the east, you've got more trips and treats, more younger families, a little bit less affluent. That's quite a useful little trick. Just by the by to other places. Check the supermarkets. So let's start looking at some of these zooms. So this is us in the top corner. So you can see Basingstoke, also northeast corner, and we've got Farnborough and Aldershot. So again, as you would expect, particularly military sites, more younger families in the sort of barracks adjoining areas. So you've got high concentrations of trips and treats there. You've also got some lower income groups, but again, lots of families, so Facebook families there as well. Basingstoke itself, again, it's a bit of a mix, but you've got some substantial areas of Facebook families in there as well. So again, that's a kind of mixed population. But then when we zoom in to the south coast, we can see that Southampton we've sort of touched on. It's got these two halves, but then obviously spreading out, you then get the dormitory dependables sort of encircling. And if we look at the catchment areas later, you'll see that all of these coloured areas are pretty well subsumed in the Southampton catchment area. Portsmouth is really weird and interesting one, and I say that with affection, having lived not that far from it. That what you have is a pocket around sort of Waterlooville, etc., of home and heritage, Facebook families, etc. So groups that are either older or potentially lower income, potentially less likely to be highly engaged. So you've got almost that sitting at the top of Portsmouth, almost like a little bit of a plug on the catchment area. So there's the whole area that's quite hard to get audiences from, that's sat just above Portsmouth. Then as you start getting further south, you've got this big bank of trips and treats all the way down through the main run of the island. And then finally, when you get down to the bottom, you've got more experience seekers. So what we see is that gives Portsmouth a very particular set of challenges in terms of audience reach, and probably as a result, a slightly more constrained catchment area. Because essentially it's almost like the audience is sort of tucked in the top of a bottle. And also then it's slightly hard to get out top. Does that make sense as a kind of slightly strange visual metaphor? So that's Portsmouth. You can see that as you get across to Gosport, you get some slightly different groups. That's the only place, I think, in the whole of Hampshire where there's more kaleidoscope creativity than anywhere else. And then as we go further west, as we get in, the New Forest is very much the same kind of picture in terms of community culture buffs. Okay, so given that, we've talked about there being lots of this group, and this key audience group, and if you can sort of locate yourself on this map, you might be able to see, where some of these concentrations are. So Southampton is effectively ringed by this sort of big band of community land culture buffs, but also there are loads up towards the northeast, as well as throughout, but it's not in the big urban centres, essentially. If we start looking at the trips and treats, we talked about the pocket in Portsmouth. There are, of course, those other pockets, Southampton Eastleigh as well, interestingly, and then far to the northeast. Okay, and then dormitory dependables. The other large group tends to be much more sort of Middle Brittany. Again, there's a tighter band around Southampton with this group, again, as well as spread further afield. Now, this group, often when we look at them in terms of their behaviours, they tend to, they are culturally engaged, they do things, they tend to be more likely to go to things that are quite high profile or quite known and recognised. They're not necessarily looking for things that are strange or experimental or, obscure. But there are a lot of them, and as we'll see, they could be quite important in the mix for a variety of reasons. Okay, so it's a lot of talk about audience spectrum, but hopefully that gives quite a nice little portrait of the different parts. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we move on any further? For some reason I've just lost my little chat buttons. I can't see if anyone's got anything in there.
None in the chat right now.
Okay, so everyone happy? Everyone's sort of making sense. Okay. So one of the things we asked in the Cultural Participation Monitor was a range of questions about not just what people have done, which we've got, and we'll talk about in a sec, but also how they feel about COVID and attending in general. Now, these figures are from about 3 months ago now. So in a sense, the absolute figures here may not be the important thing, because people's attitudes may well have changed as Omicron came and then started to wane. I think what's potentially most interesting is the relative positioning, because what we've seen throughout COVID is that certain groups have been different relative to the average. And so if the whole average has moved, they've gone with it, but they've stayed relatively in the same position. So in that sense, the broad picture is, which is a really unexciting research finding, but hey, sometimes they happen. People in Hampshire are fairly normal on this measure. So compared to the overall population, they're about as happy to attend. There are about as many people who say they've considered reservation, and about as many people who say they're not quite comfortable attending yet. and roughly speaking, it's a third, a third, a third. So this is where people were at in kind of November time. So it's not radically different here from elsewhere. We do see some relatively big differences when you start comparing, let's say, London to Cumbria. So you do see some sort of big disparities there, but this is pretty much in the average. Perhaps unsurprisingly, because we've seen 2/3 of the population from those three quite middle groups. In terms of attitudes to COVID, you know, what kind of approach people should take? Should we absolutely try and stamp it out completely? Should we just try but not go overboard, or we just have to live with it? Broadly speaking, again, it's fairly similar to the national average, with a bit more of a skew towards you just have to live with it. So just a little bit in that direction, but not huge. And clearly the main result, most people are saying, yes, get rid of it, do what you can. Again, we'll ask these questions. We're going to into the field with another version of it very soon. Yes, was it broken down for age groups? It was, great question. So the two questions split in slightly different ways, and Elise, correct me if I'm mistaken on any of this, but in terms of being happy to attend, older groups were less likely to say they were happy to attend. So they would say, yeah, it's a bit of a risk. I know that I'm in an older group. I know it's more you know, challenge for me, so I won't. But if you then ask them, well, so what should we do about COVID? They're relatively more likely to say, essentially, you know, bad stuff happens. So yeah, you just have to accept that it's there and just slog on through. Whereas some of the younger groups are more inclined to say, no, let's really get on this and stamp it out. Which doesn't necessarily match attendance behaviour during COVID, where older groups were inclined to do less and younger groups were inclined to do more. Does that, I'm seeing Elise nodding, which is always encouraging. It's a bit of a paradox, you know, people are strange and complex creatures, but that's the kind of broad spread in terms of age profiles. And what we are seeing in terms of age as we go forward is that younger groups and more urban groups are much more likely to say, okay, now I'm happy to go out and attend stuff, you know, it's not such a risk for me, and you know, we have to enjoy life as well as be careful. So we are seeing the younger groups being the ones who are most likely to be engaging at this stage. Okay. And then we ask people, and this is an unfair question maybe, or at least will be when we can check how right people were. Do you think COVID will be having an impact on our behaviours in 6 months' time, in a year's time, in 2 years' time? Again, the headline story here for Hampshire is the responses are basically typical. The headline story overall is that there was, you know, people were fairly convinced that things would make a difference in 6 months' time, but they did expect it to drop off. So we will see in, you know, 3 months' time or so how true that was. I don't know how optimistic everyone's feeling, but okay. So that was just a few things at the kind of population level that people were saying from the monitor. So does anyone have any thoughts or reflections at this point? Is there anything in any of that that surprised you, or things that matched your own experience, or, you know, when you've looked at your own audiences? Any particular, you know, any particular things that reinforce maybe things that you've been thinking about, or that you think have any implications?
I'm unsurprised, and I wish I was more surprised. I think there's a lot of us that could count the older generations to be the bread and butter, the loyal attendees, and the fact that the results of the questionnaire are essentially, I'm less likely to attend, but on the other hand, there's nothing you can do about it, is a little bit, but what can we say? So for me, it's just confirming really what our suspicion was. We've seen a lot of loyal attendees not coming back or being very nervous about coming back.
Yes, that's interesting. And we could if there's a bit of time later to say a little bit more about some of those groups and what they've said about measures and stuff. But I think it's true, the highly engaged older groups, we're seeing them being a little bit less reserved in terms of attendance, but it is coming down to how fundamentally important is the arts to them, because if it's super important, it outweighs other things, and if it isn't, then it doesn't, which, yeah, it's a bit tricky, but yeah. If you don't mind me asking, you able to say any more about some of those groups who are returning or not? Because I know we've heard quite mixed pictures from different concert halls and classical organisations around the country, some of whom are saying, oh, we were really surprised we put stuff on and it just sold, and others saying it's proving really, really hard.
We're seeing a lot of late booking, which typically would have been more the jazz crowds kind of thing, as opposed to the classical audience. Classical audiences tend to book very early, and they have everything in their diaries as quickly as possible. The jazz crowd tend to not plan ahead because they're cool, man. So yeah, that has shifted so that everybody is booking really late, which is obviously a headache if you're trying to market things. I think it's also difficult, and I wonder if anyone else is feeling this way. The way we are communicating with our audience has changed through COVID and out the other side. So it's difficult to pinpoint where the fault of it is. But we are seeing our friendship, our membership group have not dropped in numbers. Now that we've started putting events back on again, the number has raised back to where it was pre-COVID. So I'm taking that as an encouraging sign that hopefully they are intending to attend as the year progresses. But yeah, certainly some things have absolutely sold out and been rammed to the rafters, and other things that I would expect to be an easy sell have been quite a hard slog.
That's interesting. And is that shift between easy sell and hard sell things that might have been more like quite classical traditional core product? Is the stuff with easy sell?
Yeah. Ordinarily I would say some of our classical stuff would sell quicker, or we'd have a stronger base audience to sort of kick off from. Whereas the things that typically in the last 6 months we've seen fill the house have been more jazz global skewed, which is great. I'm very happy about that, but I want all the houses to be full because I'm selfish that way. So I don't know whether that trend will continue now that we're moving kind of out. I do feel like there's about to be a shift as we kind of come out the other side of Omicron and people are going, oh, there's no restrictions now. But certainly, which we are still encouraging mask wearing. We're still trying to make people feel safe, regardless of whether or not that's now government policy to enforce. And hopefully that will keep the confidence levels up. Anybody else feeling like their audience figures are a bit weird?
Go on, someone else must be happy to share.
I can, yeah, exactly the same as Joe. It's that some of our traditional stuff that you would expect to sell really well has been a bit more difficult because the reliance we have on probably that older, wealthier audience that just isn't there anymore, that, like Joe said, the traditionally book quite early aren't booking as early. But I think because we opened a while ago, so like last June, I think we were before other kind of theatres anyway from that we've spoken to outside of our region. And I think that I feel like with some of the products as well, we've been quite lucky that they've been more focused towards younger audiences, like everybody's talking about Jamie and Six, and those have been absolutely full. But it's kind of Les Mis that it's doing really well, but not as well as it should be at this point. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that classic, older, more wary audience that would traditionally be our bread and butter and fill our houses, not coming back as soon as the fresh new product. So I think it just seems like a general vibe from us.
Yeah, that's interesting. That Les Mis might be something that really appeals to those dormitory dependables, and it might be that's where they, because when we looked at that same question about how keen are you to return, they were a few percentage points above average for all those groups. So there may be, if you find little pockets of them around and about, they might be worth fishing in. But no, interesting. Speaking on the jazz thing, are we talking a young jazz audience or an old jazz audience? Because jazz is one of those things that can break either way.
For us, it tends to be a mix. Typically, our audiences are older, but it depends. We've had things like, for instance, Seed Ensemble, who are incredibly gifted young group that have been doing incredibly well. Sort of in their London houses are packed, and they pack the house. And I think that was a much younger audience skew than usual. Jazz is a difficult one because it's a bit like mushrooms. You can't say jazz is jazz. That it's all, they're so different to each other. You can get, you know, trad jazz or ambient jazz, or so it's a really difficult audience to sum up as a whole. But yeah, I would say typically they do run younger than our classical base.
Cool. That's surely quote of the day. Jazz is like mushrooms. Anyway. Cool. Sorry, this is a risk of another massive tangent, but a lot of what you're saying does remind me of a piece of research that we did actually a few years ago now, long before we even knew or thought about COVID, talking about this idea of a sort of what we called a generation gap, that there was essentially quite different cultural tastes, cultural interests, cultural patterns between people who were above and below, roughly speaking, 40-ish. I say roughly speaking to give myself a little bit of leeway. Anyway, but as what we were predicting was, as baby boomers grew through into the kind of 60, 65 group, you could potentially see a spiking in that quite large cohort attending a lot, being relatively affluent, and then you get a sudden dip as they start to stop attending. And so we were expecting a tricky moment for the arts in 5, maybe 10 years time, of a sudden pivot away from baby boomers. We are wondering, and we think we're seeing through COVID, that pivot essentially has come forward, because lots of people in that age group, if they stop attending, are they going to come back, and if so, for how long? And the younger groups being more actively engaged, there's likely to be a bit of a tip of product towards them, because they're the ones who are actually coming back now, and so that shift might start to happen earlier. So that's quite an interesting kind of dynamic to think about, albeit not necessarily a comfortable or easy one. Anyway, Fab, shall we take 5 minutes now and then push on through later rather than breaking in 10 minutes time? That seems like a good place to stop. Yes, so we just take 5 and then we'll come back and we'll look a little bit about the local audiences and what they're doing. Hi, Lizzie. Fab. Thanks, Marcus. Okay. So, is that us? That's mostly here, I think. In which case, let's have a little bit of a look at audience behaviour, who's coming, and what they've been doing, and profile over time. Now, I'm aware that we probably don't have a preponderance of performing arts venues here, so some of this content is a bit skewed that way, so I might just sort of tone that down a little bit, but for those of you that are at venues, this will probably be quite handy, but so we just have to strike a balance. So if it will give me my cursor back. So overall, so we took data from the Audience Finder ticketing data. We did have a check on the survey data just for a couple of particular things, but largely we've been working with the ticketing data. And this is roughly speaking how much data we are talking about. Specifically, we looked at people who live in Hampshire, not people attending Hampshire organisations. if that makes sense, unless we've specified otherwise. So they could have been attending elsewhere, although we'll see that they probably weren't, because we can look at where people are from. Broadly speaking, across the 4-year period we looked at, all pre-pandemic, there has been a gradual growth in bookers, bookings, number of tickets, etc. And bear in mind, this is based on a consistent cohort of organisations. So it's not just that we got more people signed up for Audience Finder and therefore it grew. These were all comparable organisations right the way across. So a modest but not necessarily huge growth. And we can then look at that proportionately using an index figure. So the index essentially says, if we treat whatever the figure for any of these things was as 100 in the first year, where is it relative to that starting point in the second, third and fourth years? And what appears to have happened is a bit of a dip in 2018-19, but then rallying to a kind of higher position than it was for 2019-20. Does anyone know, is there any obvious reason, sort of anything in region that might have affected that you're aware of? Is there anything that was sort of a big reason for a blip in 18-19? And it can't be anything like a venue closing, because it wouldn't have been in the consistent cohort if it was not in for 1 year. But so we were a little bit surprised by this, but essentially what we're seeing is a broadly upward picture. And although income has grown more than everything else, of course, that's income in standard pounds. So inflation would mean that it should be going up relatively faster than everything else anyway. So that in itself wasn't necessarily too surprising that came out on top of that list. So income per ticket went up, but actually bookings per booker, tickets per booking were, if anything, down, but marginally in most cases. So essentially, it looks like there's been slight but not enormous growth across the board. However, when we look at art form, there does seem to be some substantial differences. Now, for this, we've left out the 2019-20 financial year because some venues didn't do their coding for 19-20 in March 20, April 20, etc., because of COVID. So we've got, 75% of it coded, but not everything coded for that year. So we've just focused on the other 3 years. And broadly speaking, what appears to have happened, most notably, is a drop in musical theatre across this time. I think that is something we've seen in some other places as well. That might be interesting in the light of Les Mis comments, whether in a way we're picking up a trend from a few years ago. Is there a bit of a wider shift in taste going on? I don't know, but it's something to think about. So I suppose the main thing I'd say about that is, before jumping to any hasty conclusions, I'd look in a fair amount of detail at your own data in terms of that. But particularly if you can, look at your own data split out by different types of audience, different audience groups, because sometimes we see particular groups move quite a lot, and that's what's pulling the overall average. So that might be worth having a look at. Other than that, they've wavered, but they've stayed fairly flat. Dance appeared to have a little bit of a peak year, 17-18 for some reason. I have a pet theory about that, but I don't know that it's reliable, so I won't share it. But yes, so that's the overall picture by art form. And we've got here the audience spectrum profile of bookers across the 4-year period. So again, this is anyone living in Hampshire who booked for anything in Audience Finder across the country. And the notable thing to me, I think, is that we saw in the local population that community line culture, staunch dependables, trips and treats were really key groups. 2 of those are overrepresentative relative to that large population sample, and so that's giving us our kind of 2/3 of engagement from those groups. So I think that's kind of worth noting. And actually, arguably, dormitory dependables are more over-indexed than anything else. which is perhaps surprising, but might reflect, because most people are attending locally, albeit this isn't just for local venues, it could reflect that local venues are actually quite well tuned to these really core chunks of population. So generally speaking, you're programming for these big groups, and therefore it's really appealing to them, and therefore you're getting the overrepresentation, if that makes sense. At least on an aggregate, obviously different venues will do different things. Now we also looked at how different groups were changing over time. So again, this is using the index, so using 16, 17 as kind of 100. Obviously the proportions were different, but if you treat them all as 100, are they relatively higher or lower than that through time? We've grayed out the middle bit to say, let's not get excited by 5% moves, because that really could be just be noise. And indeed, we shouldn't get over excited about this in general, but where I think it is interesting to note is that the middle engaged groups are skewing either higher or lower. So trips and treats particularly higher, voluntary pendles a bit up. But families, despite being low to start with and underrepresented, is growing, relatively speaking, so that might be worth thinking about. And these top groups are all, particularly the top two, groups that tend to have lots of families in them. So again, that might suggest the growth of a potential family audience and less from older groups. So although two of them are inside the grey band, and so I'm slightly breaking my own rule by even mentioning them, the bottom three groups here are the three oldest groups, and I think that's not a coincidence. So it could be, even before COVID, there was a bit of a drift towards an older audience and a decrease in the older audience and an increase in the family audience. We know that post-COVID, families are one of the groups that are keenest to go back and return and engage in, you know, cross art form. So that would be true of galleries and museums as well. And there's greater reluctance from older groups. So this trend is likely to have, if you like, been inflected and kicked on as opposed to mitigated. So probably there was a drift in this direction that COVID's made more extreme. So again, that might be worth considering in terms of both promotion and program. Does that surprise anyone in terms of the shift? No. It's probably, I would have thought it's probably one of those things that feels perfectly plausible and likely without necessarily being something you would have assumed in advance. But I don't know. Anyway, so that was a general trend. If we start looking by geography, we can see that as a starting point, 2/3 of tickets bought by people living in Hampshire were to organisations in Hampshire. So it is very largely a local audience, particularly when you think that this includes people who are living right on the eastern boundary, or right at the northern boundary, who are as close to whatever Guildford as anywhere else. So very heavily concentrated in region. And if they were booking tickets elsewhere, half of them were elsewhere in the southeast, so it was still pretty local. And then, of the remainder, half of those were then southwest, and so on. So a pretty local audience. There is a moderate slice. So this is 20% of a third. So a 15th of the tickets are in London. So there is people, there are people making that journey, but it's not a huge proportion by any means. And similar picture when we look at survey respondents, which will typically be galleries and museums. Now, you would expect a slightly more spread audience for galleries and museum attenders, I guess, because it's more likely to be linked to tourism trips, for example. And although this proportion is lower for just from Hampshire, by the time you go to the southeast, it's about the same proportion. So it may be less immediately concentrated, but actually it's still a relatively localish audience. Okay. We can also look in more detail about where people were coming from. So this is where, again, we can see some of these concentrations. So yes, big concentrations in the big urban centres, of course, but again, could have quite big pockets out. And I'm trying to work out actually where that is. That's too far north to be Fareham. It's Elise, can you remember? And this dark pocket used to be Eastleigh, north of Portsmouth. It's sort of Waterlooville, but it's just a little bit west of it. But anyway, so you have these pockets around the region. Less so in some of these more peripheral areas, but of course they'll also be being served by other places that people might be going to Salisbury Playhouse or Festival Theatre, I guess. So, what are local audiences doing, or what have they been doing during COVID relative to the overall population? So here we can see, in a way, this is another one of those instances where the research findings are there aren't really much in the way of findings, because people in Hampshire are behaving like the overall population. So it is fairly typical, broadly speaking. Similar proportions have anything in person during the pandemic of any art form, and it maybe dropped a little bit more in 2020, but it was back to average in 2021. It's pretty much in line for the most recent attendance. And then if we look at online engagement on the right hand side, it's just a little bit lower across the board, but then the population is a little bit older across the board. So again, you would expect to see that kind of pattern playing out. So less of a rush online in Hampshire than elsewhere, but not radically. And then that pattern seemed pretty consistent beyond that. It looks like that figure that's higher at the bottom is within the margin of error, so I wouldn't again get too exercised by a sudden late peak. So broadly speaking, the impact of COVID on the region has been typical or slightly more than average. And we can see other art form splits, which again is pretty steady across the board. So it's not that there's any one type of thing people have stopped doing. Museum and heritage has been the highest type of thing that people have done out of these categories, but again, it's in line with or slightly below the national picture. And obviously, we can compare that to the typical figures, which from memory are about sort of 70-something%. So it is depressed, particularly given the longer time period. If we look at the types of things people have been doing online, again, it's just a little bit lower for everything. It's not there's any one thing that people haven't been doing. And these are reasonable proportions of the population. 1 in 5 people saying they've watched a live streaming is far from nothing. 10% of people pretty much saying they've been on a virtual tour of a museum. That's, I think that's probably higher than I would have guessed in advance. So even if it's slightly below the average, possibly, that's still, I think, pretty good. So that's the picture, and then we look at sort of creative engagement activities. If anything, slightly higher here than elsewhere, but again, it's absolutely marginal, so I wouldn't get over-exercised. And again, you can see, lots of people are doing creative things. 2/3 population have done creative activity of one or other of these sorts, albeit we've listed reading in there, which obviously is picking up quite a lot of people. Okay. So we also asked people about their attitudes to these measures. In some ways, the most useful thing, picking up on the conversations we were having, is about attitudes to measures in general. So these grey bars on the right-hand side are probably as useful to you as anything else. which is to say that people, broadly speaking, think that, well, certainly 3 months ago, thought that safety measures were important or very important. Most measures in most cases were getting, 80% of people saying they were at least important. So a lot of desire out in the population to have measures in place, particularly if you think that there were a third of people saying they were just happy to attend. There aren't enough people not saying these are important for that not to overlap with that group. So even people happy to attend are saying, yes, but can we have the safety measures, please? We will, as I say, check in the next few weeks whether that's moved. We might see that people have suddenly stopped caring, but I suspect it'll probably stay high for longer than we might expect, if that's not a paradox. I expect it to be longer than we expect. But you can see it's quite high proportions. There are differences between indoor and outdoor. People very little for most measures, but things like masks and ventilation, people care about much less outdoors, which does make sense. In terms of the difference between the southeast, which this is rather than Hampshire specific, the southeast overall, and in fact, the previous ones are southeast as well, rather than Hampshire. There's maybe a little bit less of a desire for ventilation, a little bit less of a desire for masks, and maybe a little bit less for some other measures as well. But that, I think, is tying into that picture of just a slightly greater degree of what we might call fatalism from an older audience, but they may just choose not to attend instead. So it's not necessarily better news, I'm afraid. We did also ask people if they had attended post-COVID, did they want the same measures or more measures or less measures? And with it, and then as a follow-up, we said, well, would you come back if the measures were as they had been? Did you see it and then get put off? People hadn't broadly said that they wouldn't come back with the same measures. So that's one thing. People are broadly happy with measures. And indeed, given the choice, most people wouldn't change them. So again, that's a sign that it's not that people are saying, I would come if it was safer, if you'd done more. They're just saying, it is what it is. I'll decide whether to come or not. That's kind of the lie of the land. But clearly there is an appetite for measures to be in place. We have got a comparative for the southeast here, but I really wouldn't lean on it too much. It's not radically different enough given how tiny the sample is. So really, I'd rely on that top figure. Broadly speaking, people want the measures to be the same. It's the kind of message, bearing in mind that this was from November. So, it may have changed by now. We'll find out soon. And indeed, we'll share when we find out at a summary event. So, if that gives us people's overall picture, this is the one which, this is where I would really love to be giving you much better news than this. But we asked people, do you expect to attend film, live performances, indoor galleries, museums, or outdoor historic parks and gardens, more, less, or about the same in future? And we then took the number that has said more and subtracted the number whose percentage who have said less to give us a kind of net. Are people saying they're going to attend less or attend more? Now, most people said they were going to attend about the same. So that's the first thing, not to panic you. Most people are staying where they are, but more people are likely to say they're going to attend less for basically any indoor activity. And that's particularly true of indoor sat down activity, and it's particularly true if there isn't a particular reason, because it's film as opposed to live performance, which you genuinely can't get in any other form. So that's the overall picture, but people are going to do more stuff outdoors, they tell us. But that picture is even more negative in this region. So in the southeast, people are more likely to say they're going to attend less in future rather than more. And that, I think, is because we've got these large concentrations of these kind of middling age groups, often who are slightly older. So they're middling age, so it's not a kind of be all and end all, they have to attend. But they're a bit older, so there's a motivation not to. and they were attending in the first place, there is actually attendance to reduce. Because clearly, if you weren't going to start with, then there's no reduction in attendance possible. So that combination of three things, I think, does mean there's potentially a slightly greater bite from this kind of unwind of COVID in the southeast, and I think particularly in Hampshire, because I think what we've seen of the Hampshire population skews more in this direction rather than less. So that does potentially present a little bit of a challenge. However, you do have some substantial pockets of other groups who may be available for, if you like, a bit of replacement, and or the big community land culture crops groups you've got are likely, by and large, to stay enthusiastic if they're already actively engaged. You've got lots of experienced seekers, particularly in Southampton. So that might be something to look at there. They are price sensitive, but they are interested in quite a lot of, quite varied cultural things, and prepared to try stuff out. And they're keen to attend now. We know that families, there are lots of families in the area, lots of those middle engaged family groups, and families are keen to do things. I joke that there's something about being shut in your house with your family makes you desperate to go out and do stuff. I think it's also wanting to take kids to stuff. I think it's not just escaping them, but it might be a bit of that too. So there are, I think, opportunities there, but also some particular challenges. So just check I've not. Yeah. So there's a little bit of technical stuff on the side, but that's yeah, into exactly how we calculated it. But that's the broad picture. So, what does anyone? I suppose first up, does anyone have any sort of questions on, if you like, clarification questions on what any of that meant, what it, what it said, what other bits you sort of would like to know? And following on from that, then, does anyone have any reflections or questions, or questions you want to ask each other in terms of what this might look like or mean, or how does it match what you're seeing already? Does anyone have any thoughts? So I saw a few people sort of nodding or scribbling things down when it came to the kind of like, oh, who might these other audiences be? Are there bits of your program that you're seeing as opportunities for these groups, or things you might think, oh, actually, if we did a bit more of that, then maybe that would work? Or the other one that I was wondering about, and this might particularly apply to some of the heritage organisations, is thinking about the importance of family groups and how to reach those, and what that might look like. Does anyone have any thoughts or reflections on that?
I feel like I've done a lot of talking this morning. I'm sorry,
everybody.
That's great. But no one else is piping up. So I guess it's not necessarily pertaining to kind of what we can do or wherever. One of the things I do wonder when I look at the kind of audience balance across the region is there any data on how people are responding in terms of what I would refer to as a sticky floor gig, like gigs, rock music, bands, places like I don't know, Southampton's O2 Guildhall or places like that, because I'm just wondering if they're seeing the same or similar patterns, or whether it's totally different. Because I always feel like we're missing out on a massive audience base, because okay, there might not be such an audience for that, although I don't like to generalize, the older the audience get, but like certainly for myself, nobody has flicked the magic switch yet where I wake up in the morning and go, oh, classic FM it is, let me switch the radio over. So I'm far more likely to attend a festival or a rock gig or something. I'm far more likely. So I'm just curious as to whether there's any, I don't know, capacity plans to sort of bring in other data from elsewhere? Because I feel like, as particularly as you were saying earlier about that odd generation gap dropping away and making room as the baby boomers die off, sort of the next sort of round, their audience habits might be very different to what we're used to and used to sort of banking on.
Yes, I mean, I think their habits will be different in all sorts of ways. I think there'll be some stuff around formality of presentation, formats, length, you know, whether there are events that you could have sit quietly and listen as opposed to sort of can be a little bit more relaxed in. Taste, I think that there's some really interesting stuff done about taste in what was it? It was coming out of the Great British Class Survey. That was a thing done ages ago. It's a big sociological thing about social class, but it looked at the kind of the taste patterns of people within those groups and by age. And there was really much more of a sense that in older groups there was a kind of, they may not use this language, but there's kind of this high art and then there's popular art, and they're different things. Mm-hmm. And you like one thing or maybe you like the other thing, and that's, you know, whereas I mean, we know that it often doesn't really overlap like that. That what tends to happen is you have people that like everything, and then you have people that like only one thing. But increasingly with age, there's a sense that those hierarchies are eroded, if not exactly gone away. So you'll have more of a sense that people will say, yes, I'll go to a gig, but I'll also go to a concert, and I'll go to a contemporary art opening, but I'll also go to a festival or whatever. And there's less of at least less of a visible sense of hierarchy. What there does seem to be, which is a kind of interesting little effect, is that people will talk about things almost like kind of like, not like a guilty secret exactly, but a kind of like, you know, I like this stuff, but I also like this. But the but gives you a bit of a clue that the idea of hierarchy hasn't totally gone away, but nonetheless it is flattening quite a lot.
Yeah.
So,
I would be really curious to talk to, like, for instance, I don't know if you have done this already, Victoria, maybe you have, and your team, maybe you have, but like, I'd be really curious to talk to the guys from places like the Guildhall and say, how are your ticket sales for comedy, for rock bands, for some things that are probably off the heritage theatre concert hall track? I'd be really curious to know whether their ticket sales post-COVID are reflecting the same patterns as we're seeing. And I'm sorry, I'm just posing more questions, but
no, we love questions.
But that's my current thought at the moment. Just from the conversation in the first half of this, I was just thinking we're missing like a snippet of knowledge here, because I feel like I'd be really interested to know whether this is pattern across the board or whether it's just for what we would class as arts attendees as opposed to not.
I think it is.
I'm going to. Yeah.
And we're sort of on the brink of having audience finder data that gives us at least clues to some of that, because we'll have comedy stuff coded into audience finder, even if it's, you know, it's not that we're not generally picking up data just from pure comedy clubs. We're getting the comedy stuff that's happening elsewhere. We need the lead time for people to have coded the data and it to come in to be sure. So it's coming in soon in terms of the audience finder version of that. But certainly from the population survey, we are seeing younger groups who tend to be into more like that stuff being more keen to.
Okay. I just, you know, it would just be an interesting thing. There's lots of those sorts of venues right across the region, as there are for what kind of gang we are. So I think if it turns out they're having extraordinary success, then we may be missing a trick, or we not in terms of programming so much as perhaps they talk to their audiences differently or something. But anyway, I'm going to be quiet now. Somebody else should talk.
Oh. But I think that thing about how to reach other audiences, there is a thing about the whole experience needs to work for that audience group. You know, it has to be messaging and product and timing and layout of events and so it's not easy just to dip into that audience, but equally it's probably possible to sway in that direction. So yeah, what does anyone else think? What does this look like from well, in fact, a particular question of mine I'm really curious in the answer to is how have people found the domestic tourism, particularly around heritage organisations? Is there any kind of, has that helped? Has that replaced other audiences? Has it changed audiences? Yeah, how's that been?
I'd say from our point of view, like largely our audience, or a huge part of our audience is overseas. So we have obviously had a difficult kind of couple of years. Although we've moved so much of our offering online, we've got a virtual tour. I noted that was mentioned earlier on. And that's actually been really successful. And we've run kind of monthly guided virtual tours and lots of events around those. So that's worked out well for us in that we've managed to keep those overseas audiences engaged. But in terms of on the ground, obviously, we haven't had those sort of huge loads of people from America and all over the world that we normally have. So we have found that difficult, but we have seen that there has been a bit of an uplift in sort of, UK, people holidaying in the UK coming to see us, which is nice, because that's an area that we've sort of been working quite well. We've sort of struggled with a little bit in the past. So that's what we're sort of focusing on. So yeah, it's been interesting. And then the family thing I think is quite interesting, because Jane Austen's house isn't particularly family friendly. We don't have like big kind of rolling National Trust grounds, very, very small garden. It's a very, very small house. But again, we've noticed that there's been a lot more families recently visiting, and we haven't necessarily, we've kind of done a bit more family marketing, but not a huge amount. So again, wondering whether that's sort of people just exploring their local area a bit more. And so we're focusing, our marketing's focusing a lot more on our local area now, which is challenging but exciting.
But we have seen people saying they expect to attend stuff more locally in future, even beyond COVID, once it's been and gone. Obviously during COVID, then people are definitely much more local, but
yeah, absolutely.
Is that online tour, is that ticketed at all, or is that
so anyone can just go and do the virtual tour themselves, but if you want to have an expert sort of taking you through the rooms, explaining various things, like zooming in on certain objects, talking about where Jane Austen wrote her novels, etc., then we charge for that. It's like a monthly tour, which we've been doing them for I suppose about a year now, and they sell pretty well. So yeah, our new world of Zoom has worked out quite well for us, and keep having to kind of up our Zoom capacity for certain events. So there's definitely huge benefits we've had from a difficult couple of years. Things that we certainly wouldn't have a virtual tour by now, I would have thought, if this hadn't happened. We also didn't have online ticketing, if you can believe that, before COVID. So we have to look at the positives as well.
Do you think that tour is going to stay as a kind of staple?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's much easier for us to manage as well. As I said, it's a really small site, so it's previously we had no idea. You'd open the doors and you could get 10 people, or you could get hundreds of people, and in the summer it could get very, very busy very quickly, and there'd be lots of queues, and that's not a good experience for anybody. So now at least we can stagger it, and so we found that to be obviously really effective, even though at the moment obviously the numbers are much lower than we normally would have. But it means that that's one thing. We also felt that people needed to feel, exactly as those last few slides showed, people needed to feel comfortable, particularly in a site so small, because it can feel very crowded very quickly. And also from our volunteers' perspective, a lot of them are retired, and so in that older age bracket, and so they didn't feel comfortable if there was going to be lots and lots and lots of people kind of coming into the house. So it's really important for us to have those timed tickets, and also continuing all those kind of COVID measures. I mean, we're still asking people to wear masks when they're in the house and in the gift shop, because it makes people feel safe, and it's very small, and it's not particularly ventilated. It's cold but not necessarily ventilated. So so it's we found that people responded very well to us saying that we were continuing to put those measures in place. So particularly we did a sort of a few social posts around it last summer, that it did feel like there was a good response to that, because I think at the sort of Freedom Day time, when some people were very worried that everything was going to sort of go back to normal, or people were going to, you know, we would just open the doors and let everyone come in and no masks and everything. So we made it very clear that that's absolutely not what we're doing, and we had some very good feedback from our visitors based on that. So yeah.
Amelia, this is very much confirming what we've seen in focus groups and museums recently, that people really are sensitive to this aspect of places being crowded, and they will just leave, not engage in places that have that feeling. And I was just thinking you might be interested, and indeed maybe other people here, we have a short event in March focusing on digital beyond the pandemic. We call it Tea Break, talking evidence audiences on the 9th of March. So
great.
Yeah, have a look out for that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to then kind of work out the balance of how many more you know, sort of at the moment, as I said last year, we're doing so many online events, and then how much do we, you don't want to completely lose that audience, but equally we then have to put more energy into our on-site events as well. So it's kind of just finding that right balance and not making people, you know, audiences that still can't reach us feel that we've completely dropped them and then gone back to sort of how things were pre-COVID. So it's that quite a fine balance, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess it's good though if you've managed to find a, you know, good uptake of a paid option, because that potentially allows you a bit more scope to say, well, it's, yeah, if it's paying for itself, then
yeah, exactly,
it's a bit easier. But yeah, oh look, people are posting links to those events in case you wanted to sign up. So efficient. Brilliant. Anyone else have any comments or questions in terms of what we've seen before I try and summarize what's quite a complex mixed picture, I think, but no, I shall push on. We are of course always available and happy to both hear what you're doing and how it's going, and share thoughts and opinions. And as has been mentioned more than once, I suspect, the community is a place to share, you know, share your thoughts, or if you've got questions you want to ask of other colleagues in the sector. Because one of the nice things about us being national is there can be very specialist organisations, very, you know, across the country who might be engaging in similar ways. So, so here is, and so the box that's blank, I might put some notes in it before we share the slides later, just to kind of capture some things that came out of our conversation. But broadly speaking, to try and distill it all, overall, yes, there's some very different profiles between the different towns and cities, between those concentrated urban audiences where you do get much more variety, and the wider kind of huge red spread we saw of community land culture buffs. We've seen previously this shift from older towards families, and we think that that's likely to be accentuated by COVID. We saw that kind of when we looked at the kind of watersheds, so which places were tending to go one way or the other. A bit more of a spread for Southampton, but Basingstoke very much holding its own in terms of audiences and pushing down at least towards Winchester, if not quite to it. And generally speaking, you know, similar to the general population in terms of engagement during COVID, if a little bit lower, maybe slightly less concern, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a likelihood for greater attendance, because again, we've got those groups who are maybe just saying, actually, you know, you just have to live with it, but maybe I won't attend as much as a result. And certainly that picture which is suggesting potential less attendance in future, on average, albeit most people should come back, just not everyone. Because of that mix, the how different groups in the population behave may become quite key. So I've got, I pulled out 5 different segments here just to sort of think about and sort of pinpoint, including those which are the biggest in the region. So there's those first 3, where there's lots of them. Some of them are particularly overrepresented before, they may be more or less reluctant. So you've got a funny trade-off between community land culture buffs and dormitory dependables, in that community land culture buffs tend to be more culturally keen, but they're also more averse because of COVID. So that might balance off a little bit. So both of these segments are probably going to end up behaving, we think, fairly similarly. So they remain good prospects, and there's absolutely loads of them nearby. Family groups, which were rising, having been underrepresented. We think that families, they're going to have reasons to keep going. The one thing we haven't talked about much yet, which could be really key, is this whole cost of living crisis that's playing out and accentuating. We've seen through COVID that some people ended up with more money as a result of COVID, and a lot of people ended up with less. So if you were someone who had a sort of secure fixed income and all that happened is that your travel costs went down, you could have been sitting there for months banking extra money. But lots of other people ended up obviously, you know, losing jobs and, you know, furlough or cuts in hours, whatever. And that particularly concentrated on groups who were already less well off. So we would expect to see, even before the cost of living crisis, people who are less well off being more tightly squeezed. Then you put on top of that, those groups that tend to be less well off also have a higher proportion of their household expenditure on things like energy and food, and those are going up faster than everything else. So there's even more pressure. So you probably will see a greater pressure for those groups, which will play out, which potentially means that the audience is squeezed at both ends. You know, the older audience who may be financially more secure but more reluctant to attend, the younger audience who may be happier to attend but now don't really have the money or leisure. So again, some of these middle engaged groups might become key as a kind of way of balancing some of those things. So I think, unless anyone has any comments or reflections, just to flag, there are other events and opportunities if you wish to come along to them, or equally just get in touch with us. You know, my email's there. All of our emails are that same format. So if you have things you want to ask or talk about, then please do. We will send a follow-up survey to say, you know, find out what you thought, what you found helpful, and obviously we would love it if you would fill that out. We'll share the slides via the community. And there's just a little teaser there to say that we've talked a lot about audience spectrum today. There is a slightly enhanced version of it on its way. So there'll be more granularity. So if you're looking at some of these big groups thinking, but that's 1 in 3 people, what do you feel about that? The groups will be starting to get more granular as time goes forward. So that'll give you a way to unpick some of those audience groups. But other than that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming along and taking part. And yeah, best of luck with it all.